Welcome to this special podcast. We're looking at the Absa Financial Markets Index, and it is an index which is into its second year, which looks at the development of financial markets across the African continent. It looks at the evolution of financial markets, and it's natural, I suppose, to accept that South Africa is regarded for a second year in a row as the most developed financial markets country on the African continent. It's everything else that is actually more interesting, frankly, because we are seeing the development of these markets, the ability to build infrastructure, the ability for countries to develop on this continent. George Asante is from Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, and we are seeing growth, I think, George, across many of the capital markets across this continent.
Absolutely. So we've seen a lot of growth, which basically mimics the growth that is being seen on the economic side. Increasingly, what we're beginning to realize is the consciousness among African policymakers that you cannot just grow on the economic side. You need a strong financial market to enable the economic side by mobilizing the necessary funding that is required. So for the past 3 years since we've been publishing this, we've actually seen a collective growth across countries. And as you rightly mentioned, countries are becoming more and more aware that it's almost impossible to grow your economy without growing your financial markets.
I mean, many African economies, of course, are commodity-based, but we're seeing an evolution of those commodity-based economies now also to broaden capital markets. Just how evolved is the capital market space on this continent? So,
that's a very important question. And what you find is that if you take the average of the continent, is going to take, at the current pace of growth, is going to take about 20 years for the whole continent to catch up with the depth of the financial market of South Africa.
So that's assuming South Africa stands still.
That's assuming South Africa stands still. So, and that is quite insightful and quite interesting. And it just tells you the variation of depth of financial markets that we have on the continent. And one of the things Absa Corporate and Investment Bank is trying to do is how do we shorten this 20 years into 5 years for the continent?
And the idea of publishing an index like this is also, I suppose, to draw attention from global investors to the domestic opportunities on the African continent. Africa is not a country. Yep. There are many countries with different levels of evolution in terms of their capital markets. Kenya Kenya's best in some areas, Nigeria's best in some, South Africa on average is the top destination in terms of foreign capital. But it's to draw attention to this environment, the last frontier market that is investable frontier market.
Yeah. Bruce, absolutely right. And one of the things you encounter or you hear when you speak to global investors is that they have a lot of money and they are investing in everywhere else, but not in the African continent, or they are very underpositioned in the African continent. Meanwhile, there is a lot of money. You can look at Europe. Europe has negative rates, and it's quite embarrassing that Africa cannot mobilize the necessary funding it needs for its growth, whilst Europe has negative rates and people are still putting money in Europe. And one of the things that will come out as you go through the Absa Financial Markets Index is that there is a lot of information on the continent, but this information is not put at the disposal of investors. And in the index, it actually sheds a bit of light on the fact that it's not enough to just have the information. Make the information available. And I think that has been one of the eye-opening sides of the index, and it's really helping.
And for foreigners, foreigners who will make an investment decision based on a Moody's, an S&P or Fitch rating in the same way, they'll go, I've got $1 billion, I've got to put it into a frontier market, pick a dot on the map and throw it at the map, rather than any sort of intrinsic investigation or analysis of their own. The world is simply too fast for that, and we don't have time.
Absolutely. And then you also look at the fact that it's one thing actually investing in a continent that has such a high growth and that has such a high interest rate differential between the more developed market and this continent, which is Africa. But that is not the end. At the end of the day, when you invest in the continent and you get your money, you need to be able to take it out. Okay.
We've seen that example come through so strongly in many South African companies who you would think are smarter and wiser than many else in the world, who get their money trapped in places like Angola, for example. And it's no wonder that many sort of capital-rich countries, the European countries, are wary of putting their money into African markets. Does this index help in the decision-making process?
It does. The index has 6 pillars. The first pillar has to deal with market debt. The second pillar, which is quite critical, particularly for global investors, it talks about access to foreign exchange. And there it highlights what is the exchange regime of the country, what is the turnover on the interbank market if you want to buy FX, how transparent is the FX market. Are there several rates, like you rightly pointed out? In Angola, you have like 2 different rates with like a 10% differential. In Nigeria, you have 4 different rates. How many of these rates are available in the market? Now, the thing that the index has actually done is to also, for the African policymaker, is to highlight the importance of having a flexible foreign exchange regime, how critical it is for a foreign investor. And as we started publishing this investor, which is sponsored by Absa, done by an independent publisher, we're beginning to see an awareness that, listen, I can control my currency as much as I want, restrict the flow of investment in and out, but there is a cost to that, and the index highlights that cost to policymakers, and it becomes a debating point. So we've seen countries like Angola now beginning to relax because they've seen that if I do this, I control my currency too much, it hurts my economy. Nigeria has done it, Egypt has done it, and increasingly we are seeing countries becoming more flexible as we measure the depth and the implication of what policymakers do on the market.
I look at rankings, for example, of the countries, and I'm surprised that Egypt is not higher than position number 11. But it was a position number 16 last year, so it is improving in the rankings. But one has this impression of Egypt being considerably more developed in terms of capital markets than it is.
Yeah, so in Egypt, and again, the capital market is a composition of several sub-markets. So if you look at the Egyptian equity market, for example, it's one of the deepest markets we see on the continent, right? As deep as you can get, probably second to South Africa on the continent. But then you go to the FX market, and then you realize the FX market actually almost doesn't exist. 2 years ago, it didn't exist, right? And then you go to the money market, and the money market almost doesn't exist. The bond market, so it's quite fragmented. And one of the things that is actually highlighted by the index is that these markets are interdependent on each other. You can't just have a great equity market on its own. The equity market must depend on the other market. And you see that. That is why Egypt is struggling. Egypt has moved up, but it needs to do a lot of work on the other markets, the foreign exchange market, the bond market, the repo market, the derivative market, to be able to catch up with South Africa and realize its full potential.
And another country that's boxing way above its weight in terms of what's happening in its real economy versus its capital markets is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is being heralded as this great beacon of hope for the African continent, growth rates of 8% a year, a flagship airline that is connecting Africa to the world. It is really doing amazing work, and some big reforms coming in Ethiopia, but it's sitting at number 20 in your rankings.
Yeah.
It's completely counterintuitive. It suggests that African economies have yet to come to grips with the power of capital markets.
Yes, and 8%, as you've said, over the past 10 years, and massive growth opportunity, and people are actually projecting that it's going to be the next China for the world. A lot of investment into all other places to make sure that things happen in Ethiopia, but heavily underinvested on the capital market side. There is no foreign exchange market. In fact, it's one of the few countries on the continent where there is no stock market. So just imagine, assuming Ethiopia has its growth rate going for it, and then it puts in place the capital market of South Africa. Can you imagine how powerful this country will become in the ability to mobilize funding to fund and propel its growth? It could be 20% growth per annum.
If you look at the state of African economies now, and you look at the real global interest in the multiple markets on this continent, and then you look at the rapid growth and the opportunities for capital markets. How different can this continent be a decade from now relative to where it is?
I mean, we from Absa were quite worried when we started seeing the statistics that it's going to take the continent 20 years to be able to position and basically converge at a point where people can now invest heavily into it. And I think in 10 years, if we didn't have something that puts the light on policymakers on the continent about the cost of not developing your capital market and how long it will take you to develop your capital market at the current growth rate, we think nothing was going to be done. So we stepped in, and we are hoping that the 10 years or 20 years will actually be converted into 5 years. And Africans have proven it, that we can actually leapfrog. And we've seen some signs from Angola, from Ghana to Nigeria, where policymakers have actually confirmed that, listen, we're looking at this report and it's shaping our policies. We're beginning to understand the impact of some of the policies we put in place to drive whatever agenda we want to drive. And I think it's become quite a relevant instrument.
George Asante, thank you very much. George is with Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, bringing to an end this particular special broadcast on the Absa Financial Markets Index. It's an in-depth look. It's the second annual report. There will be many more as we assess the value, the capability, the capacity, and the extraordinary power of capital markets across this continent.